everything you do has to have some level of alignment with some level of performance, or else people aren't going to want to continue to do it. The biggest thing when any company is going through transformation is the change and the impact of that change on the teams. Quite frankly, the hardest part of it is, for sure, I can guarantee there will be people who are not ready to ride the entire way. Really believe in it, that you focus on controlling the controllables, the things that are within your purview and your capacity to manage. Those are the things that make the difference. Specifically for marketing, when our budgets were incredibly under pressure.
I mean, all attribution is wrong by its nature, right? I mean, it is about this ability to triangulate, and we call it the attribution prism, but like basically you have to be able to, you need something that is consistent enough so you can use it for decision making, and it has to show up in a consistent manner back to the results in the P&L. Hi, Carolyn. Welcome to the show, and so glad you could join us.
Thanks, Paul. I'm so happy to be here.
So we were very excited when we came across your profile because we didn't know each other before, but we were thrilled because you have in your career have touched on a lot of the types of issues that we see again and again as companies are trying to figure out how to get past those moments where it gets difficult. And in particular, your experience in both understanding brand, but also at the intersection of marketing analytics. And you've managed both in your career. And I'd love to start there because I think it's rare, actually. Most people don't have both of those experiences certainly to the extent that you do. But maybe we can start by just talking about examples that you have or your maybe at Taylor Brands, but you could pick another one if you'd like as well, where you've seen how to think about using analytics to help companies to be able to meet their business goals, but at the same time be able to make the brand investment and build brand value.
Yeah, it's the age-old question. And, I remember back in the days at eBay, sitting having chats with one of the data scientists who was like a doctorate in data science and incredibly smart guy. And he and I kept joking, like, if we could just figure out how to prove to everybody the value of the advertising that we're doing on TV, we could write a book, we'd go on a circuit, we'd make millions, we wouldn't need to be here anymore. And that was back in 2006, 2007. So, marketers have been trying to figure it out for a long time, but I think there's so many more tools available now, and capabilities with analytical capabilities, tracking of results, that enables us to get a lot closer. It's not, ultra precise yet, because at the end of the day, brand is dealing with humans and humans aren't ultra precise, but it certainly gives you a lot more kind of proxies and estimates of how to tackle it. I think couple of things that I would say have helped us, and we did this a lot with at Taylor Brands, that gave us a lot more confidence in increasing the mix of spend on more brand level, upper funnel level advertising. First was establishing a media mix model that helped us gain better line of sight into the performance of each individual channel, but importantly, the whole, and as well as the whole as it relates to certain customer audiences. So you could see what you were getting, where you were gaining traction with new customers versus existing customers. And the best thing about a media mix model is it really drives understanding of incrementality. So, where is the, next dollar best spent to drive incremental value? And so that coupled with then actual in-market, we would do match market incrementality testing, where we would play with different combinations of investment in different channels and track the results across multiple markets that were similar in terms of size, in our case, in terms of size of stores and store footprint and that kind of thing. And that gave us more insight and more data that we could feed back into the model to improve that understanding. And then the final piece that we started to get really, that got me really excited because it really started to get at this understanding, is marrying our brand tracker data with the mix model. So you could start to feed in, all right, we spent this much money over this period of time with investment in these channels. And we saw at that same time this much lift in consideration or brand awareness in these specific markets. Like you could get to a very precise sort of understanding of it, and aligning those inputs and outputs with the brand tracker and the media mix model started to give us a much better understanding of actually which channels in particular were more effective at driving awareness versus consideration, even before you got to what drove actual purchases and revenue. So I think that is like, we were still sort of scratching the surface at that. And we were fortunate that like the size of our investment was such that you had enough investment across multiple channels that you could get the signal. Exactly. And I think it's harder when you've got either lower investment or a lower purchase frequency. Now, not that we had a super high purchase frequency with tailored brands, but I think just the scale of at which we were operating gives us more insight into that a little bit more quickly. But if brands have the tolerance and the patience to kind of do longer in-market testing, for example, that kind of thing, you still can gather sufficient data to start to get these kinds of reads.
It's interesting you should say that. And what you're describing is uh, there's MMMs and then there's MMMs. And what you just described is a key difference that we see a lot, which is what you're talking about there is the MMM is the first part of a process that actually is pretty hands-on and requires a fair amount of custom work to make sure that you're actually getting signal out of it. And one of the things I think, we're seeing at a number of companies who are trying to figure out how to use MMMs or attribution in general to open up new channels and so on is it's sort of we'll take the open source. So we're going to take a basic tool and, there's some automated incrementality testing, but it's not specific enough to their business to be actually able to be part of that process to get an answer you can really depend on. And so we see people get caught in between. Like they spend some money and they've got the thing or it sits in a drawer and they don't know how to actually implement it in such a way to be able to provide the benefit. And I think what you're describing, I mean, obviously Taylor Brand's a big business and they have the data, but actually even with smaller data sets, if you have people really paying attention and you have good data science work going on, and people have experience in how to run the right test to be able to get signal, you can actually, it really is enormously beneficial. But, often we see, again and again, pretty good or partially done data solutions are actually useless because you can't actually get the ROI benefit. Does that track with your experience?
I totally. I think you can't not only not get the ROI benefit, you also don't build the internal trust in the model, and therefore, whatever it's telling you doesn't yield any change in investment strategy or anything either. So, I mean, we experienced that firsthand. So, the first out of the gate attempt at building an MMM, we certainly didn't have the team internally to do it, and we knew we needed to get external support. And we talked to a number of different providers. We chose one that's super reputable, decades of experience in doing this, really phenomenal, but not necessarily scored for retail. And what works really well for big packaged goods brands, or some others that maybe had longer kind of cycles and didn't necessarily need the data as frequently as you do in retail, where everyone's like, what happened last weekend? It just is a different kind of approach and data need that we had. So while it gave us a lot of education on how to best use an MMM, and to your point, like the role an MMM plays in your overall toolkit to help you make decisions, we did learn that like we needed a model that was more geared to kind of the retail cycles. So we ended up switching to a different provider that was enabling us to get data at a weekly level with a combination of MMM and some MTA. And that helped a lot for us because that was what we needed for our business. But I think it's just very much so you need to make sure that like the cadence of the information, the kind of information, the scope of the information is right for what you need for the decisions that you have to make. And then, yeah, you have to realize that an MMM is not you can't just blindly follow it and do whatever it says, because it's really just one data point, and you still have to marry platform data from the ad platforms. You still have to marry definitely match market or incrementality testing. There's a lot of other data points that you need to kind of go into your decision set before you kind of make a final choice on where to spend.
When we do them, we're connecting them back to we're reconciling with the P&L. So you have that, it makes it that much easier to be able to have that conversation with finance folks about what's happening, as opposed to having to do that big rush to figure out how to get it all afoot prior to the meeting, which we think is critical as well.
Yeah, I just was going to add that that is so critical. And I think another thing that we learned in our second round with the MMM was doing a lot more to involve the finance leaders, our SVP of finance and CFO, in sort of the nuts and bolts of how we were building the model, as opposed to waiting until we had some nice fancy outputs and reports to bring them in, and having them kind of participate in, these are the assumptions that we're making, these are the metrics that we're focusing on, this is going to be the core metric that everything will center around, etc. Like, that made a massive difference in kind of the engagement and understanding and willingness to kind of ride along with us on the journey.
Totally. Do you you've been part of that. So one of the things we see, in terms of a all docs connected special, we should probably have its own segment with like a little graphic or whatever, because again and again, companies that are trying to transition from a business that has been built on performance channels, trying to make this transition to upper frontal channels, is such a profound change on so many levels that goes beyond marketing, as you just point out. Like, finance has to be along. The board often has to be along, because these are bigger bets that are harder to measure. The answer about, how definitive is attribution? The answer is, all attribution is wrong by its nature, right? It is about this ability to triangulate, and we call it the attribution prism, but like, basically you have to be able to, you need something that is consistent enough so you can use it for decision making, and it has to show up in a consistent manner back to the results in the P&L, right? That's the loop you need. But how have you found, and you've done that a number of times in your career. You've been a leader in helping to try to make that transition, which, by the way, is often existential. If companies don't pull this off, they're flat, right? They can't figure out how to get to the next level. Talk a little bit about how you, on the change management side, besides bringing in finance, how do you get the organization to come along?
Yeah, and the journey with Taylor Brands is interesting too, because when I started, they were like all brand and very little performance, and not sort of super advanced in the analytics to understand how the dollars were performing and all that. It was more of just we do this year over year and it works, and this is what we're going to keep doing. And it was a really heavy investment in TV and kind of upper funnel channels. So then it was like bringing in the performance side of it, and alongside that, bringing in more of the discipline and the measurement around it. And then very quickly the pendulum swung to, oh, we really like all of this stuff that we can tie numbers to. How do we make sure that we're still investing some money in brand? And so that was, sort of a little bit of the a shift there. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, the numbers matter, and some of us operate more on gut than others, and some are more comfortable operating on gut than others, and intuition and all that. And you can't take intuition to the bank. You can take like performance to the bank. So everything you do has to have some level of, alignment with some level of performance, or else people aren't going to want to continue to do it. And so I think even as we make these different transitions, there are ways, as we were saying, like where you can measure the performance. And if someone says, well, I don't know, it's brand, like you can't measure it. I think that's flawed. I think there are ways, like again, like you can draw kind of proxies, or sort of say, well, we did these things in this market and we didn't do something in a similar market, and we saw that this difference in behavior or performance, market versus market, like that gives you some indication, right? So engaging in a incrementality test around influencers and events and billboards or something is still going to give you some level of a read if you have a comparable market where you're not doing that, and you try and keep everything else as equal as you can. One of the best brand marketers in the world, P&G, is like known for their market testing and all that, and like that's how you build confidence in something before you scale it nationally or globally.
Totally. Let's take a minute on organization. Something that you've had, which is frankly not often true, but I think you've insisted on it at different times, is having analytics report into marketing as opposed to a shared service. Can you talk a little bit about that, your experience in both, and so on? Because this is something we again see uh, often, but maybe you could speak a moment about that.
Yeah, and I think like there's philosophical debates on it. I mean, I've been in them where it's like, well, we don't want marketing grading its own homework and that kind of thing. But I think, frankly, in the end of the day, the reporting structure is less relevant. You've got to just make sure that you have those resources dedicated to the work that you need done. And I think when they're part of an enterprise structure, analytics is one of the most prized resources in a company these days, and inevitably good number crunchers and analysts and insight generators are going to be pulled into other projects and that kind of thing as well, and you may not get the support that you need as much. And if you can have those people dedicated to you, co-located with your team alongside you in terms of understanding the goals and the objectives and what you're trying to understand, I think that makes all the difference. So whether they on an org chart report into you or not, I think the key is that you've got that dedication and you've got the alignment on the goals, and that the team works side by side to get to the results that they're trying to get to.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that you said two really important things in there. One is that the folks in analytics understand marketing enough or have context about the business enough that they can actually help to make sure the line of inquiry goes the right way. They don't always derive the insight, but it's not like, tell me what you want to know. It's like, well, I need you to have some context. The other thing that we found is that the cadence of inquiry for marketing is higher than it is in other parts of the organization. And the money is burning in the furnace in the meantime. Unlike other areas, I mean, it's happening to some degree in other areas, but this is certainly true if you have a large marketing budget and you need an answer. Until you get the answer, it's just sitting there doing what it's doing until you figure out how to optimize it. And I think that's an important distinction that I think non-marketing executives might miss, which is that and every time you see data, you shine a light into a dark room, another question is going to emerge. It better, because it's often this second or third derivative where you're like, oh, okay, now I know what to do. Like that process, if it's weeks versus days, that's just money.
Yeah, it's so true. I think first off, like I cannot agree more that the context and what you want to do with the information that you're asking for from the analytics team is so critical to convey to them. I've heard that time and time again with analytic partners, is like my different partners that I've worked with, is that the more I can tell them kind of, here's why I want to know about that, or here's why I'm curious about this particular data point or whatever, then that helps them so much understand like, oh, okay, well, maybe the way to get at that is actually this other way. And, I'm certainly not the person to tell them, go, here's how you should go and get this information. I just want to know, here's a question I'm trying to answer. And how can you help me? What's the best way with your expertise to go about getting that? I think that empowers them, makes them feel like they're part of the solution, but it also gives them the critical context that they need to make sure that they go about finding the stuff that you really want to find. And then, yeah, like the urgency within marketing just always seems greater. So having that team alongside you and knowing that this is the cadence at which you need to be operating is really important.
It's interesting. We had this conversation or two about AI and about, there's a bunch of tools coming where you're going to be able to query and get your report right away. And we can, um, and I think there's for certain aspects of ad hoc reporting, it's fine. I mean, obviously the foundational question is whether or not the data you're pulling from is accurate enough. So you're not making, which AI is not fixing anytime soon. I was talking to my brother of all people, who works in AI enablement at Walmart, and which is really interesting because he's big company and they're doing some extraordinary things actually, but um, but he was talking about the fact that uh, um, people um, like large companies have legacy systems with a lot of data all over the place. And, AI is not going to fix the fact that somebody mislabeled that field, right? Maybe, it's going to take a little, maybe eventually they're like, well, that doesn't, maybe, but chances are it's like, no, that's actually not, that's not the VCM line. You have to take that number and add it to this number and whatever. And then you get, so we were laughing about it a little bit that it's going to take a little longer than everybody expects. But, and possibly, uh, you know, it, it'll happen quicker because people, maybe we'll figure that part out. But the thing that actually jumped out, and I'm wondering whether or not you've seen this to be true too, is one of the things that we find is that it's actually a big ask to ask marketing professionals and executives to define how they want analytics, right? I mean, it's like, what question you want answered. It's like, even in the context of dashboarding or trying to figure out how to think about the growth OS for the business, like, you know, one of the things we've realized is one of the reasons why this often doesn't get built in organizations is not because maybe the engineers can't do it, because they can if they had time, but it's mostly because it has to be specified right. And that's a huge job.
Yeah, it's totally something I would push on, when we were first building the analytics team and we didn't really have people dedicated to marketing analytics. And I'd just be like, listen, like we're relying on me to ask these questions. I don't even know if I'm asking the right questions, like, because this is all so new to us and the way we were building it within the business. So yeah, I think it's like it's a process of sort of reverse engineering. I think like the best way is like the marketer does know what they're trying to achieve or what's the like end customer outcome experience, thing that they're trying to learn about. And through that, and if there's a good partnership there with people, analytics folks who are aligned with the business and get it, you can get to places where you can figure out, okay, like here are the questions we think we should ask, and therefore here are the data points we need to look at and the trends we need to track, etc. And then you may find out that actually that doesn't work. Like I was just talking to somebody the other day where they were saying they're moving away from looking at an LTV to CAC ratio as sort of their like core optimization metric and more looking at ROAS. And I was so like, I thought that was interesting because I thought, well, gosh, like that usually it's the other way around. People move from ROAS to something more sophisticated. But for them and their business, the definition of acquisition was different. And, for them, it was like there's this sort of long process of somebody signs up and get all set up, and then eventually they engage and transact. And, if they were looking at the wrong moment of quote acquisition, it was a misleading metric. And they found that like what was a more consistent metric across the channels, regardless of the action that the customer took, whether it was a sign up or an actual transaction, the ROAS number was a better number for them. So you don't necessarily know. You have to kind of play with it and understand like what's the best approach for this particular business and what you need to answer.
Totally. Totally. I think the other piece to that though, which we found again and again, is it's also, where can you shine the flashlight given your capability? So one of the things that we've seen again and again is that if you have the ability to be able to instrument all the way through the funnel, which requires data engineering work, right, and tagging engineering work, and then you can, uh, particularly for long consideration cycles like that, where you have, it's hard to connect those things together. Sometimes if you can create server side events and pass them back through automatically to test a variety of things at once, sometimes you can find a better signal. But what you're describing is actually right. We've seen again and again, and we totally agree with, which is basically like a series of you want to try a variety of different ways, see what's giving you the best signal. It's going to work for a while, then you're going to probably have to figure out another one, and that process and cadence is so important. Let's jump over to something else because I think again in your career, one of the things that I think certainly by your trajectory, but and the roles you've had, but also in our conversations, leadership is a challenging thing in this role, and figuring out how to lead companies through those difficult moments. I'd love to talk a little bit about how you've approached that in your career, maybe an example or two of where things have gotten tricky and you found a way through for the company. And this is at its core something we see again and again. And I'll remind everybody, as who's listening, these things are hidden because they don't really get reported necessarily, but the value creation and destruction is breathtaking for companies where if you don't figure it out, the company goes sideways and starts to go down, it may not recover. But you've had a lot of success in this. So maybe let's talk about a couple examples of where you've been able to help to lead from your role to help companies find their way through.
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing when any company is going through transformation is like the change and the impact of that change on the teams, and helping manage the teams through that change. And quite frankly, the hardest part of it is that like there are going to be, for sure, I can guarantee there will be people who are not ready to ride the entire way, and you maybe don't, it's not right for them and it's not right for the company because they have a skill set that is attuned to a particular need state that the company may no longer be in. And as such, I think that one of the biggest challenges that a leader has to face with this kind of transformation, but one of the things that really drives the biggest benefit, is really doing an honest assessment of the team, the players in the team, their skill sets, their capabilities, who's got the never mind necessarily even the skill set, but the aptitude to change. Because there's certainly people that I have come across in my career who, didn't know how to tackle the next challenge, but were ready to dive in and figure it out. And then there were other people who were like either non-believers or afraid or just not willing to do something different, that were wonderful people, but not right for what we needed next. So I think that the hardest part then as the leader is to make that call and have those conversations with the people, give them a chance, tell them what you need. Here's what I need. Here's what I'm getting from you today. Here are the things that, I would need to have change. But have an honest conversation with them. If it's not right for them, they're not going to be happy either. And they're better going to a company that needs exactly what they're really good at. And don't linger too long on making those moves. That's, I think, one of the really key things that I learned was, you want to keep giving people the benefit of the doubt and think, oh, well, maybe they are going to be able to adapt and change to what we need. But if it's reasonably evident that that's not going to happen, everyone, including the employee, are better off with you making those moves more quickly so that you can move on for the company and they can move on and find the thing that's right for them. So it's really hard because you're dealing with people. I'm a very empathetic, I care a lot about my team, and I think it's so important that you've got people really engaged and feeling supported and empowered and all that. And it's very hard if there's not the right fit. But there's rarely been a case where if it's not the right fit and you don't make the move, like you've got to make that change. This is better for everybody.
Have you had folks who come with you in the journey across multiple companies? I presume you have.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's part of it, right? Is like if you and I've been fortunate to work in a couple places where there's a whole cohort of people who work really well together and went through a lot together and have like this sort of shorthand understanding of things, and it really helps when you then move together because you can then you're able to kind of keep on to the next challenge. And you've already got a like shared level of trust and understanding that that is there. So yeah, I think we all come across great people in our career that we want to work with again. And if you have that opportunity, I think it's always great to be able to seize it.
The other thing that's both of us have spent a lot of time or enough time working to have transitioned through some really, really tricky times. And certainly over the past 4 or 5 years, we were just laughing with somebody else, not laughing, maybe crying a little bit too, about the amount of tumult over from 2019 to now, right? Like COVID and then this and tariffs and then this huge run up. And um, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you've approached that in your organizations to manage that what amounts to a roller coaster ride and deal with that level of external change in the midst of trying to hit your numbers. Tell us a little bit about how you approach that.
God, we joke that like we were selling suits to people when no one was getting married, no one was going to fancy parties or events, and no one was going to the office. Like, who the heck was wearing a suit? And we feel like if we get through that, we can get through anything. But I think that like the biggest thing is, it's so easy to get whipsawed by what's going on in the macro environment. And it absolutely, there's no question it impacts your business, no matter what size your business is. But there are certain things that you can control and certain things you can't. And, you know, lots of people have said this, but I really believe in it, that you focus on controlling the controllables, the things that are within your purview and your capacity to manage. Those are the things that make the difference. So, specifically for marketing, like when our budgets were incredibly under pressure, we took a look at every single line item in our budget and looked in infinite detail at like every single contract that we had, every single agency we were working with, every single, photography shoot or whatever that we were doing, and all of the line items within that. Like, where are the places that we can, make tiny changes to optimize and, save dollars so that we can maybe save the money that's being used for production or non-working dollars and turn that into spend for media that helps get our voice out there more, so that we're not needing to get incremental dollars. And in a way, I think that helps the team, because if you give everybody and help everybody understand, in all of your areas of responsibility, there are things that you can control and you can manage to help us get to this goal. It helps them feel like they're not powerless and that they're not, just bystanders as things are going up and down in the macro environment, that they've got pieces within their world that they can manage. And that's really empowering and motivating for them as well.
That's a fascinating thing. My career has primarily been in growth stage, go, go, go. I mean, certainly I've dealt with those calls I get from investors is like, nope, we're not growing anymore. You got to be profitable next week. We're like, well, that's going to maybe take longer than a week. But what you're describing here is such an important, particularly for middle market and for growth stage businesses that have to figure out how to get transition through that. That's a fascinating technique, which is you got to give them something to work on that resets how they are thinking about what they're doing every day.
Yeah, exactly. And it was like, I would do that across, like, whether you were buying media, you were shooting, photographs in the studio for the website, whether you were, designing a email, like every single one of them had some way that they could, manage it and cut their costs.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about how you think about when you're folks who are in line roles at growth stage middle market companies, Fortune, units of Fortune 500 companies and so on. When you're thinking about executives who you see coming up, given, a very, very complex environment, maybe it's always been complex. I can't really remember. It seems like it's harder now. I don't know. Maybe it's not. There's certainly much more opportunity in a lot of ways. But what advice would you give them about how to, if you're in the marketing profession, what types of skills, what types of approaches, what types of temperament, what advice would you give them to help them to figure out how to go and be successful in what is, going to be an uncertain future in a lot of ways.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating time for people who are looking to build a career in marketing. I think, there's particularly recently, there's been a lot of talk about entry level jobs, and the sort of precarious position they are now going to be in. And I think that's super worrisome, I think, for marketers, because that is how they all get started and learn and all of that. Um, I think I don't know if I've got the answer for that necessarily, but what I do find, and this was kind of true even before AI, but I think it's even more true now with the way we will be harnessing Gen AI, is there was a period of time where we were all generalists as marketers, and we all kind of tackled everything. And certainly I came from packaged goods, where you were the quarterback across like all the different disciplines and everything. And then with the rise of digital marketing, and it became a lot more kind of the real heroes in marketing were the people who went way deep in a particular area and were real experts on SEO or CRM or search marketing in general or whatever. And those were the people that were kind of moving really quickly in their career progression and all that. Um, and I think now it's kind of going back a little bit more to the generalists. And the reason why is because with things like Gen AI tools and agents and all that are going to have those like core functional capabilities. And you're going to need someone more who has the context of how all those capabilities fit together, who can direct that and be that quarterback and guide that. So if you're a marketer who knows SEO really, really well, and granted, like SEO in general is going to dramatically change, you're not necessarily as well versed in brand or necessarily in analytics in the same way or whatever. And I think like you're going to see more and more people who are the generalists, who have the context that is really the differentiator between the human and the agents. That's the skill set that you need. So for all those people who have grown up in media planning and buying, or who've grown up in creative or brand strategy, I'm constantly encouraging them to, they don't have to do a 180 career pivot, but go find a project that you can get involved in that will help you round out your skill set. And if you're someone who's always done brand strategy and you don't have a lot of strength in analytics, like go work on a project where you're harnessing Gen AI to do creative testing and work with the analytics team on that testing framework and the reporting of that and the analysis of the data. If you're an analytics person who's never really understood how creative works, like go work with somebody on the other side of that with the creative testing and figure out what are the different variables that you can test within creative, and how do you understand an insight around a customer that will lead you to a creative execution or whatever. So I'm constantly trying to find areas for my team to find those moments of cross training and encouraging them as part of their development to go find those opportunities, because I think that's going to be the context that they're going to need to be able to harness the tools that will be available to us in the future.
It is extraordinary how fast things are changing in that regard, and how actually the other thing that's really amazing too is what used to take a really long time to read yourself into something, with being a successful prompt writer, which is its own skill, obviously, is really pays off because you can very rapidly get answers that are not complete, right? I mean, you have to be a critical thinker, and you can't presume everything you read there is going to be good, but it can bring you up to speed very rapidly and give you some context for how to start to do that stuff, and then allow you actually to be more effective helper when you go across the department and you talk to that person, because you're not completely clueless. You could start with a little bit of a baseline understanding.
There's a couple of things I think are true already, but will be more true with Gen AI. And one was, we were talking earlier about how important it is to share, like as I work with my analytics partners, of giving them the why I want to know an answer, or like what's the question I'm trying to answer. Like that context is so important. That is like the gist of a successful prompt these days. And that's the piece that the AI is, as much as, tools now are like AI is helping people write prompts and all that too. Like the one thing it doesn't have is the broader context that's outside of the knowledge that it has. And you've got to give that to them. And so that context is like just so critical to it. So I think that's like that's a skill set that, no matter what, is going to be important. And so, like, having a broader context and a broader purview of understanding these different things, and being the second thing is being able to speak those different languages, right? So if you can go and understand the language of creative and brand strategy, and still understand the language of analytics, and understand the language of marketing technology, and the language that the CFO wants to speak, like, that's what makes a successful marketing leader, is, kind of being fluent in all of those different languages.
That's beautifully put. Actually, and maybe ultimately the most important thing of all, which is that it is about building bridges across all these things, um, and helping to connect, because each of these things are, staying more and more tech. You pointed out it's SEO. SEO is changing in a just, absolutely fundamental way, and the numbers are shocking. 30% of searches now, right? Like overnight. Yeah. Um, so I wonder, as we talk about this, I wonder, um, do you find that I presume you're optimistic, right? I mean, I'm thinking about the people that you work with, right? And whether or not that we can all rise to this challenge. Um, I am. I think, I think what is right, and this has been true again and again, is that each of these cycles, each of these disruption creates winners and losers. And that's not going away, and probably is going to accelerate here in ways that I think we probably can't anticipate, but we didn't anticipate it any of the other times either, frankly. We just had to do what you're describing. Um, uh, how do you think about, when you think about the sectors that you know about, which of course is all these ones, how do you think about, uh, what do you think the main success factors are for instance, in retail, omni-channel retail? And that's a broad question, but what kinds of things do you think are really critical for companies to be thinking about to make sure that they find a way through this? And this is sort of first principle, high level.
I mean, I think some of the fundamental truths are not going to change. And I think what's so I'm so curious to see what happens with Gen AI, is like, how good will AI be at understanding people? Because people are so complex, and emotions and motivations, and you know reasons why people do the things that they do. Like, we are people, and we have trouble understanding that, and that's like the gist of being a good marketer, is like being able to kind of, tap into that in a productive way. But that's what I'm so curious about. Like, that's where I feel like there's parts of this that I don't know how the, like, intelligence, the artificial intelligence, is going to replace that piece of it, where there's stuff that's just so unpredictable. So I think, like, the way companies who harness AI will continue to be successful is to continue to hang on to that, and know that, like, the one thing that you can't just, like, abdicate all of everything to your AI, because, like, the thing that you're fundamentally trying to do is connect and engage with your consumer, and that's a person thing. And I don't know if Gen AI will, like, maybe it will eventually get there, but, like, I don't know how it gets there in the, you know, next while, at least. Who knows at this point? But I just think that, like, that fundamental truth of marketing is, like, stay focused on your customer and what they need and what motivates them and what inspires them. I don't think that will change. I think how you solve that for the customer will totally change. But that understanding and context is still going to be really important.
That's beautifully put. And that, I can't think of a better place to stop. Carolyn, thanks so much for taking time today.
Thanks. It was really great.